One of the reasons why I really wanted to get Marty to come here is that the article that I read about him in the New York Times was about his implementation of technology at Goldman Sachs, and if you will, the fights and the struggles. He's not on yet. Great, so thank you, Susan. The fights and the struggles that he had to go through to start to implement technology at Goldman Sachs. So as a little bit of background, as I was sending Marty my questions that I wanted to talk about this morning, one of the things that I read through in his bio was that he started Harvard College as a sophomore. So my assumption was that Marty had gone somewhere else for his freshman year and transferred to Harvard as a sophomore. So as I wrote it, I said, I'm going to ask you where you went to college for your freshman year, and then why you transferred to Harvard, other than the fact that your 4 other siblings all went to Harvard. And Marty wrote me back and he said, well, actually, I took enough AP courses in high school to skip my freshman year at Harvard. That's why I entered as a sophomore, and I was the oldest one in my family, so they all followed me. So that ruined my question to you, one of my first questions. But Marty then went on to Stanford and got his PhD in medical information science. So I guess I'll dive in. I want to back up a little bit and start with your upbringing in Santa Fe. Neither of your parents went to college.
That's right.
And your father was Mexican-American. So what's it like growing up as the son of immigrants, father being an immigrant, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, hadn't gone to college? What were the role models, and what were you thinking life for Marty Chavez was going to look like?
Well, so to start right there, yes, we're Spanish and Mexican in our ancestry, but my father was not an immigrant. Actually, his family had been in what is now the United States since 1580. Huh. So the way we like to think about it is the rest of the country sort of immigrated to us. We were always there. Anyway, but it was an interesting way of growing up, in that in Albuquerque, New Mexico, I don't know if any of you have been there, looks an awful lot like this. This is greener, at least today. In Albuquerque, about 70% of the people are Hispanic, and many are like my family. They were Spanish Jews, actually. They fled the Inquisition, and they got as far away as they could go, right, which was northern New Mexico, and then they got left alone for 500 years. And so we were the majority by a long shot, except in economic and political and other terms, we were the minority. And so I credit a lot of it with my mom's tough love. She had really no interest in that and no time for it. And she said since the beginning, to get half as far, you're going to have to work twice as hard, and just do that.
She was a court stenographer?
Yes.
So she understood the sort of the tough love side of things, potentially, from listening to judges.
She'd seen a lot of it, and she was very specific. She said that when she was 10 years old, at least this is the family lore, that she was going to do one of two things. She was either going to be a nun, or she was going to have 10 children and send them all to Harvard. Now, how a little girl growing up in the barrio of Albuquerque got the idea of sending kids to Harvard, we'll never know.
So she only got halfway there.
She's a top grader.
She sent 5 to Harvard.
She gives herself a 50%. Yes.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So you go to Harvard, and when you're there, you're studying biochemistry.
Yes.
And computer science.
Yes.
What drew you to them? And then you went on to do a PhD in medical information science. And I'm wondering to myself, what was going on in medical information sciences in the 1980s? But give us a little bit of insight into why you pursued that.
Well, again, my mom comes up. So I've always been a computer scientist. That's what I've always been interested in since I was little, math and software. And a lot of people will say to me, well, you've done all these different things. You went to medical school. You work on Wall Street. Like, how does all that fit together? And so what I would say is that I've always been doing the same thing since I was about 10, which is solving hard problems with math and software. And the kinds of problems keep changing, but the core of problems with math and software has never changed. And so I showed up at Harvard, and I was in the Science Center. It was freshman week, and the professors in the science departments were recruiting. And I remember a professor comes up to me and says, biochemistry wants you. And I said, well, I have no interest in biochemistry. And then he told me something that I think was really prescient and profound in 1981. He said, the future of every science is computational. And so we need computer scientists in our science. And if you sign on the dotted line for biochemistry, I promise you that you can do an awful lot of computer science and just take one lab course, and we'll call it a biochem major. And so that's how I ended up as a biochem major. Why I went to med school is mom wanted a doctor in the family. There's really no other answer.
Just as Marty's talking about that, it just reminds me that in 1982, the cover of Time magazine, it was the first time they didn't do a Man of the Year. The 1982 cover of Time magazine was Machine of the Year. And Time had a big debate internally about whether it ought to be Steve Jobs on the hardware side or Bill Gates on the software side. And they ended up kind of punting and making the two of them the protagonists in the magazine, but they gave it to Machine of the Year. So just from a timing standpoint, as far as where Marty was in 1981 and at Harvard and being told what he was told by his professor, that it's kind of interesting that that was right at the advent of the software and the hardware world at that time.
Absolutely, yeah, that's when it was blowing up, yes.
So on to Stanford, why medical information sciences, in the sense that today it seems perfectly obvious?
Yes.
Information science around the medical profession is a huge space. Why'd you go do a PhD in that at Stanford?
So I applied to a program that's run by the National Institutes of Health. It's called the Medical Scientist Training Program. It's an MD PhD program. And I wanted to go to a place that had a great PhD program in computer science. That was Stanford, and it also had a med school. So in those days, Stanford was doing a lot of early work in artificial intelligence in medicine, and that was the lab that I was in. It was called AIM, Artificial Intelligence in Medicine. And our aspiration was give a computer all the clinical findings and all the laboratory test results, and then the computer tells you what disease you've got and what treatment. And it seemed conceptually like something that would be doable. And as we got way, way into it, we ran hard up against a fundamental problem, which is in general internal medicine, there are about 900 disease categories. There are about 10,000 manifestations of disease, fever and so on. And so the complexity, the number of time steps to solve the problem is on the order of 900 to the power of 10,000, which is an unimaginably vast number, and the computers were just not fast enough. So we were all getting a little bit despondent, a little bit depressed. We could solve toy problems, but we couldn't solve big, real-world problems. And in particular, I remember three of us who were so passionate about this, but we were just hitting a brick wall. And so one of them was me. One of them went off, and to this day, he's the head of Microsoft Research. And by far the most successful of us was more interested in helping people figure out what movie to watch. And that was my office mate, Reed Hastings, and right. He went off and started Netflix. So,
right.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild. Your roommate is Reed Hastings, and you sort of sit there and go, wow, look at what he's done and what I've done. You've done a lot, Marty. So let me, you leave Stanford and you start a software company called Quorum.
Yes.
What was Quorum focused on? Because there's a segue here from doing your research you just talked about, founding Quorum for 4 years, and then getting to Wall Street. And so take us through that quick progression, because then it starts a whole different path of your life.
Yeah, so basically what happened is one day an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley contacts me out of the blue, and he has this idea, but he needs a techie to actually make the idea real. And the idea was, wouldn't it be great if you could run Macintosh computer programs on computers that were not Macs, right? Then there was a bunch of reasons why that would be an interesting and hard thing to do. And how he got to me is one of his buddies from Stanford was my cardiovascular physiology professor, who said, I got this kid in my CV Phys class who has no interest in CV Phys, but a lot of interest in software, and you should talk to him. So we went up and started the company. It was a fascinating, brutal experience. People think that the tech industry just goes from strength to strength. Actually, the only industry that I know of that's more cyclical than the one I'm in, financial services, is software. It's just been a while since we bottomed out. But in those days, it was actually a nuclear winter of technology in Silicon Valley. very hard to get companies financed, very hard to get them off the ground. Most of them failed. And so out of the blue, I got a letter in my Stanford mailbox, and my office mate Reed got the same letter, and the letter just said, an East Coast investment bank is interested in you. And he threw the letter away, and I thought, I'm going to take this bank for a free trip to New York. I was a starving entrepreneur and grad student, and I thought I was scamming them. And so I went, and I had a lot of fun in New York on a very busy weekend. And then on the Monday, I went to my interview, and I remember they said, do you want the math quiz or the computer science quiz? And I was a little startled, like they're giving me a quiz, and I took both the quizzes, and then I talked to this funny bald guy named Lloyd, and then they made me an offer.
Did you talk to a funny bald guy named Lloyd back then?
Yes, Jay Aaron. Jay Aaron, it was currency and commodities, and he was one of the partners there, and they had told the headhunter, make a list of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley with PhDs from Stanford in math, physics, or computer science, and ship them in. And I just happened to be on the list, so it goes to show you that I was preparing for a career on Wall Street by being an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley with a PhD from Stanford. Unfortunately, the universe hadn't told me what I was preparing for, but that was it. So that's how I ended up on Wall Street.
Just one quick thing on that. Remember back to what John Rice said yesterday as it relates to most of us pursue our strategic plans with tremendous more rigor and guidelines than we do our hiring policies as it relates to minorities. Imagine if in that remit of finding Stanford PhDs to come to Goldman Sachs, they'd also added in there and also someone who is a minority, and what that filter would have done to have gotten and attracted people like Marty to Goldman Sachs or wherever else. I just raised that because yesterday we were just talking about diversity and how people actually go about implementing their diversity plans, and they typically stay on the sidelines rather than be front and center.
Well, and it certainly says a lot to the candidates, right? To me, it said this bank is really serious about computer geeks for some reason, to be so intentional and specific and to go shopping in such a disciplined way for those kinds of people, recognizing didn't have those kinds of people in the numbers that were necessary, so go find it one way or the other.
And when you joined Goldman on the currency and commodities desk, were you an actual trader, or did they say, go figure out some computer algorithms to help us more effective on the trading desk?
I was at Goldman executing a strategy that I developed when I was 10 years old in Albuquerque as a gay Latin kid in a very fancy all-white prep school. I did the math for the popular people. And so
So you're doing the math for the popular people.
Yes.
You're at Goldman Sachs.
Doing the math for the popular people.
And then you decide to take your show over to Credit Suisse.
I did.
So you left Goldman for a period of time and went over there to their energy derivatives desk.
Yeah, which taught me something, right? So Credit Suisse came to me and said, well, Goldman, you're doing the math for the energy business, which is great. We want you to come over and run the entire energy business, right? And this has always been a thing in my head, right? I don't just want to be the computer geek. I actually want to be a business leader. And at that time, it seemed to me that I could have a great career at Goldman, but I was going to get pigeonholed as the computer guy, the software guy. And so what Credit Suisse was offering seemed really appealing. But I went on to discover that some firms had all the same problems of Goldman Sachs, and then they had a whole separate other list of problems. And so I put that whole experience as teaching me gratitude for Goldman Sachs.
So two quick things happened while you were at Credit Suisse that I'd love your thoughts on. Long-term capital management and the meltdown of Enron. So you're inside of Credit Suisse working on energy derivatives when long-term capital management fails. Anything from that we can look back on and say, don't want to have that happen again, or we saw something at that time that happened with long-term capital management that we should never go back to?
Yeah, I mean, it might seem a little bit geeky, but there's a fundamental thing that went wrong at long-term capital management, which is almost always the thing that goes wrong in a financial crisis, which is you're long a bunch of things, and then you're short a bunch of other things, and you think that you're hedged, but actually they're just different, and they don't necessarily offset one another. And and they can, we call it on Wall Street, we call it a Texas hedge, right? When actually the hedge goes the same way as the thing you were hedging. And so you've just amplified your risk.
Gets really big.
And it gets really big.
Like Texas.
Yes, don't do that. Actually, I left Credit Suisse, and it was 2000, very much a sign of the times. It was the dot-com boom. It was the absolute peak of the dot-com boom, and I figured, well, I know a lot of people with capital, and I know this business, and so I'm going to go start something. And so I did, and it showed the craziness of that time, circa January 2000, which is I sent out to my network a one-page convertible note document, and I said, if you want to invest in this company I'm starting, wire your money to this account by noon Eastern time tomorrow. If you have any questions or concerns, don't invest. Like, I'm not negotiating, I'm not taking it.
And so how much money do you raise for Kiodex that day?
It was a really, almost a metaphysical moment. I look at the bank balance, and it's got $15 million in it, and I thought, okay, well, I guess I better get going.
What was Kiodex going to do?
Yeah, and so now we take it for granted as software as a service, right? It's a big concept, the idea that you would just subscribe to something and then somebody else would go through all the pain of running it for you, and you just tap in. We do this with Amazon Web Services, we do this with Google Search, everything's on tap on the internet. Back in 2000, that concept didn't really exist, so we were a little bit early on it. But I got a ringside seat for Enron because Enron was one of our investors. And I remember in the negotiation with Enron, they were very, very concerned about the bankruptcy of my tiny little poorly capitalized company. I should have been more concerned.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You should have got an option to buy Enron for $1 or something.
It should have been symmetric.
You should have gone the other way.
Exactly.
So you form Kiodex, you sell Kiodex, you're on Long Island hanging out on vacation, and somehow or another get this gravitational pull back to Goldman Sachs.
Oh, the gravitational pull was the booming voice of Gary Cohn. He called me up and said...
So it wasn't Lloyd who came back, it was Gary this time.
It was Gary. Gary was my actual boss in the oil business, and Lloyd was his boss at the time. So Gary called me up and he said, I heard you sold your company, congratulations. I heard you're retired, that's ridiculous, and I'm just calling to share with you that you're returning to the mothership.
So were you at that time were you retired?
I was staring at the ocean. I was so fried.
And you were done?
I was done.
Okay.
I was done. I just
no
sat there on
need
the
to go
beach.
back to work, just said, all right, let's go have some more fun.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So you go back. I think that's important only because this piece of the conversation is what I really want to dive into, which is just that Marty took on a lot of issues as it relates to technological implementation at Goldman that I think somebody who wasn't as far along in their career and financially independent as Marty was might not have the opportunity to have been. Mm-hmm. So you're inside of Goldman, you're focusing on technology, you've got 9,000 technicians working for you, and you're like, we need to take the trading technology that is our proprietary technology that we give to our brokers and bankers every day that makes Goldman Sachs special, and we need to give it to our clients. How well did that one go over?
Well,
because I have that conversation with our bankers and brokers all the time about what information do we have at Walker & Dunlop that we should be giving to our clients, and I get kickback left, right, and center of saying, whoa, 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 whoa. The phone's going to stop ringing if you take what I have as far as proprietary information and you give it to my client.
Right. So I've had a long history of doing this at Goldman Sachs. Even during my first tour of duty at Goldman, I had this idea of opening up by the web our business. So giving to our clients who had just executed a derivatives transaction the valuation from our perspective of that derivatives trade. And I remember this is a classic Gary Cohn kind of teaching moment on the oil desk. So client had done a trade, they put it into the little website that I had built, and they looked at the mark to market, and it was a substantial negative number against them.
Right.
And they called up the salesperson angry.
WTF.
And the salesperson started shouting, like, if we didn't have Marty's website giving away this information, we wouldn't have this problem. And Gary had this, as I said, this booming voice, and he stood up and he said, the problem isn't Marty's website, telling them the details of their transaction. The problem is you need a better relationship with your client. And so that was an early read on actually being transparent with the client. Like we nowadays execute very large trades for our clients, and we say, this is the mark on the trade. And it's going to be positive for us and negative for you because we're a for-profit enterprise. This is how we make money. We buy things for a little bit less than they're worth, and we sell them for a little bit more than they're worth.
Will you talk to all my clients today, please? I hope you all heard that and how great we are at Walker & Dunlop.
And being coy about it doesn't serve anybody, because here's what actually happens in our business, and I'm sure there's an analogy in your business. If we're not straight with our clients about the nature of the business that we're doing, then the only thing the clients can do is go put us in competition with 4 other dealers and have all of us make them a price, and then they pick the best price, right? And yet, in our business, what happens when you're doing a transaction in very large size and you go get 5 bids in comp? It moves the market against you, and everybody gets a worse result. The dealers can't hedge. The client actually gets a worse result. When if you backed up and you just shared it with them and you said, this is how we're valuing it, this is how we're risk managing it, yes, it's expensive, we are not aiming to be the low-cost provider, and we're giving you total transparency into your deal. This is better, sticky, repeatable business. And even now, many years later, I run the trading business of Goldman Sachs, and every once in a while, there's still a little bit of a whimper from some trader, like, really, you want me to give away that mark or that model? And my answer is yes, and it wasn't a question.
And so when you did that, did it materially change the volumes that you were doing? I mean, you sat there and said, what we're doing right now is X of volume on an annual basis, exactly to that competitive. Everyone's sitting there saying, okay, pick a number. I don't know what billions of dollars that you were looking at as far as trading volumes. How long did it take for you to see the return on that sharing experience?
Very early on, one of the things that I'm proudest of working on at Goldman Sachs is we invented a way for big companies to buy their shares back and to do it in the format of a very big derivatives transaction. And why is that better for the client? They actually get their shares back in at a discount to the volume-weighted average price. It sounds like a miracle. They're selling volatility. They can't monetize it. We can. We share the monetization with them. Everybody's happy. Best kind of trade. To do this requires total transparency. Company has to file an 8K with the SEC. They have to disclose the entire transaction. The entire market knows the hedging volume. Like, everything is right out there in the open. And in this business, we invented it, and we continue to have the dominant market share 15 years later. And the reason is the clients don't have to check the price with somebody else, because everything they need to check the price is right there. We make it available to them over the web.
And from a competitor standpoint, have your competitors all followed you down that path, or is Goldman somewhat unique in doing what you're doing?
It's interesting. So for those of you in the open software world, there's this thing called GitHub, which is where people put all their open software. Microsoft now owns it. And so all the banks have software on GitHub. They all do. And you can go check this independently. Someone actually wrote, well, here are all the banks that have stuff on GitHub, and 3 of them have something material on GitHub that's open source, and one of them is actually serious, right? So we've opened up our quant libraries. Everything that we do under the hood, your own developers can do with a little bit of Python, and they can do it from home. They don't need all the computers of Goldman Sachs. They don't need to install any special software. It's on tap over the internet. So yes, we're very serious about it, and what we have noticed is that this is increasing the engagement of our clients with us. They are plugging their computers directly into our computers, and that's a great place to be, right? It's just like in Silicon Valley. Once you're in the Google ecosystem or the Amazon ecosystem, like, you hardly ever feel the need to go check an Amazon price away with some other website, right? It's too easy with the one click, right? That's the concept we're going for.
So in a company that is, or was, if you will, built upon people,
Yes.
The greatest resource at Goldman Sachs for a long period of time until Lloyd called it a technology company was the human resources, the people, the bankers, the brokers, the people who made Goldman Sachs what it was. I read in a Harvard Business Review analysis of Goldman's technology that in your cash equities desk, which quite honestly I don't even know what the cash equities desk is, but in 2002 Goldman
Fancy
had
word for stocks.
There you go.
Stocks, yeah.
There were 600 people on that desk in 2002,
Yeah.
and by 2016 there were 2.
2. Not
So
200.
in a company built up with people who
Yeah.
come to Goldman Sachs to build a career, how do you sit there and take the innovative technologies that you're talking about, the open source software,
Yep.
and still continue to both build the company, and then also I want to get to training people to be the great bankers that come and build their careers at Goldman Sachs. But on how do you sit there and say, this is our strategy, but guess what? This means that a bunch of you are going to lose your job in the process.
Okay, so I think a really important note, if you look at a company that we think of as sort of being the ultimate platform company, there's a few. One of them would be Google. Google has nearly 100,000 full-time employees, and it's just been on a one-way trajectory. Goldman Sachs has, I believe right now, an all-time high number of employees. So in that important sense, we are, just as Google, and always will be, a people business. Having said that, the skills of the people are changing in a really material way. I remember about 10 years ago, I gave a town hall to the securities division, the trading business, which I now lead, and well, here's what I said. I said, I see 3 stable career strategies as it relates to computers. Strategy number 1, you tell the computers what to do. You're a computer scientist, a data scientist. And that's a great strategy for some set of people who have that set of interests and skills. Fine. Number 2, you collaborate effectively with machines. You do not set yourself up in competition with machines. Like, I don't compete with my calculator to see who can multiply 10-digit numbers faster.
You might win that. You might win that.
I leave that to the calculator, right? So you learn to collaborate. You depend on the machines. It's a symbiosis. And reliably, we find that the machines might be great at something and people might be great at something. The unbeatable combination is people with machines. And you find that again and again. And then the third strategy, and I told everybody I don't recommend it, but I'm indifferent if you want to adopt it, is you will be replaced by a machine. And then I went on to say, and if I find you engaged in manual processing that a machine would be better at, I will find you and I will make sure that you do not keep that job, because that's our job. That doesn't make any sense. And I remember my boss at the time said, wow, that was really dark. And I said, well, I was intending to be helpful, right? And because there was still, in those days, there was plenty of time to get ready for this. But back in those days, just 5 years ago at Goldman Sachs in the trading business, there was this kind of hubris, right? Yeah, software is eating the world, and we see it happening in this industry, and we see it happening in that industry. Our business is special. Like, computers really, they will never be able to trade like we do. When I was co-head of the equities business, I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to run a series of experiments. We're going to have a computer trade out of a book of risk, and we're going to let you trade out of a book of risk. And if you do a better job in risk reward than the computer, then you'll keep your job. And that's how we got from 600 to 2. It didn't, right? It just didn't make sense, right? And yet, there are many people who have retooled and reinvented themselves and have very long careers at Goldman, right? My point is, we don't want to get rid of you. We want to get rid of you doing a particular task in a certain way. You cannot bet your career on that. If you're not constantly adapting, then you're gonna be roadkill.
And do you look at it, Marty, as it relates to sort of there are clearly some areas that can be disintermediated quite easily.
Yes.
From an outsider's perspective. And so when you talk about sales and trading, a trading desk, and taking technology that sits there and says, well, the trader can do it, but the computer algorithm can do it quicker, more efficiently, and cheaper.
Yes.
Versus the relationship side of the business, which
yeah.
is, I'm an investment banker. and I bank Warren Buffett.
Yeah.
And there's only one person on the face of the planet who Warren Buffett picks up the phone when he says, I want to go buy Heinz, and that's your banker at Goldman Sachs, who takes the call and flies out to Omaha and has the conversation. How much resistance is there on that side of the business as it relates to the implementation of technology? And do you think that side of the business ever gets disintermediated?
So for people who have world-class relationship skills, who can identify their client's pain point and convince the client that only they have the solution to stop the pain, those people are in short supply, and they're going to have amazing careers, and they're only going to become more valuable. Nobody at Goldman Sachs disagrees with that. You described one such case right there.
Right.
And there are many people like that, and we have thousands of them. And maybe the computers will get to that in 50 years. I don't know. But I don't think it's anything that anybody needs to worry about anytime soon. Now, there were other kinds of people who were also described as salespeople, but I would describe them as they sit by the phone rings not because of that salesperson's world-class relationship skills, but because that salesperson is sitting at that desk at Goldman Sachs, right? And someone calls and the salesperson says, well, today I got brown potatoes and I got red potatoes. What do you want? Like, that kind of job is going away. It's gone. Because computers are much better at that. Turns out if our clients know that they want red potatoes, some particular kind of stock, they'd rather just push a button. And actually on the client's organization side, the asset managers, they would rather not have that person either. Like, why do they need someone to press a button that talks to our computers? Why don't they just have their computers talk directly to our computers? So those kinds of processing jobs where you're talking on the phone and typing something into a system, that's going away. We don't need expensively educated people for that. But for people with those relationship skills, that's only becoming more valuable. And everywhere we look at Goldman Sachs, all of the roles are blending and they're changing. So for instance, years ago, we used to say traders commit capital and engineers write software. But the markets had evolved to the point where engineers were writing software that was putting orders directly into the marketplace. And so it was a fiction to say that the traders were committing the capital. It was the software written by the engineers that was committing the capital. So now we have a regulatory status at Goldman Sachs called traders who code. The way they trade is by writing code that puts orders into the marketplace. And we have compliance professionals who code, and salespeople who code, and bankers who code, right? Coding is just a tool, like typing, and you got to be able to do it.
Do they get paid like a trader? So
Do
do the engineers, do the coders
Yes.
get paid like
Yes.
traders?
They're traders. We actually thought,
So how did you, just for a quick second
Yeah.
on that, how do you've got to, I'm assuming, go back 15 years, there's a comp model.
Yes.
It's got traders getting comp this way. It's got
Yeah.
engineers and software programmers getting comp this way.
Yes.
And all of a sudden you brought the two together.
yes,
What comp model do they go onto?
the trader model.
The trader model.
It's the trader model, absolutely. Risk-adjusted rate of return. That's how we're measuring the traders who code, and that's how we measured the traders. We thought about calling them engineers who trade, but we ended up with traders who code.
So it's fascinating. You have a database called SecDB.
Yeah, we're not
which
good at
is
naming things.
like
Securities database.
securities database.
Yeah.
That is, I want to go back to your comment about long-term capital management and the fact that the models went wrong.
Yeah.
So you've built up this massive database that's running something like 500,000 scenarios a day.
Yep.
On what would happen if XYZ happened simultaneously on this massive portfolio that you guys have and control in both your private client services and your own proprietary desk and everything else.
Yes.
How do you, so two things. One, you keep that to yourself or let other people see it. And my understanding is that someone came to you and said, we'd love to license it for $1 billion, and you said, nope, it's ours and we're not giving it to you.
That was then,
That was then. So have you changed your viewpoint on that?
We sure have.
Okay, so just a little bit on
Yeah.
SecDB and what it does and then the licensing of it.
Well, I could talk about it all day, but the short form is back 25 years ago, we had this thought, which is let's take all the trades, all the risk, all the time series, all the models, and let's put it all in one place. Now, the software that could do this didn't exist, and so we built our own, and that's how I ended up at Goldman Sachs. I was part of that recruitment effort. And here's what Lloyd noticed, because he had actually commissioned it. Why did he commission it? Okay, he had had a 10-year history of going back and forth with the technology division. He'd say, I want a risk management system. They'd go off for a year, they'd write some software, they'd come back, and they'd very proudly unveil it, and he'd say, this is not what I had in mind. Actually, he might not have put it so politely. And they would go back and forth in this endless iteration of unhappiness. And so Lloyd finally realized he was part of the problem, which is he didn't know how to tell software engineers what to build. And the software engineers didn't understand trading. So they were all talking past each other. And so he said, I'm going to go to Bell Labs. That's where you find engineering geeks back in the early 80s. And I'm going to get one, and I'm going to put him next to me. And then he'll figure out what to build. That, I think, was the biggest insight we had. If you treat the software people as IT people, would you reboot my machine for me, please? Right? And as a service organization, then you'll get one result. But if you treat them as peers, and they're on the trading desk, and they're part of the business, you get a very different result. This is hugely successful for us. And so when you put everything in one place, you can start to ask questions like, what if interest rates go up? And what if oil prices go down? And what if the stock market goes up? And you can start to do all these what if scenarios. Now, Lloyd would say, we do not predict the future, but we're excellent predictors of the present. And what he meant by that is we've just got a lot of information, and we're looking at everything in the world as it exists right now, and we're asking ourselves what might be the case in the future. Today, there's still plenty of time to do something about it. But if you're not asking yourself that question, the future arrives, the horse has left the barn, there's nothing to do. You've lost the money. But up front, there's plenty of things you can do. And so this cycle became so successful that Lloyd got paid and promoted. And as he got paid and promoted, he said, I want those engineers and I want that SecDB thing in my new business. And then when he was CEO, that was it. It was kind of wall to wall across the firm. And I would say I'm just the junior guy who rode along with him up the chain that way. Now, as the world has changed, we've realized that once upon a time, the information asymmetry was so great that having that information asymmetry was valuable to us. But over time, as more and more people got software and there was more information, there was more market data, the game of information asymmetry was not something that we could feel that great about because it was not inspiring for the clients. You know, to tell your clients, we know more than you do is not going to be exciting for them, right? And so over time, we realized we just had to play a completely different game, which is a game we learned from Silicon Valley, which is engagement. Just do what it takes to keep our clients coming back to us. And if one of the things it takes is sharing the data and sharing the models and letting them plug their software directly into our software, then that's what we will do. And now the game has changed in a very significant way where our clients are saying to our arch rivals, we like the way Goldman's providing services, everything, directly through computers, through APIs, and we want you, Goldman competitor, to do the same thing using the same API that Goldman invented. And for us, that is ultimate success. If we can have our competitors playing a game of catch-up that way, that's a good place to be in. So that's the strategy.
So on that, as far as competitors, I checked this morning, and Goldman's market cap is $4 billion more than Morgan Stanley. So I think you're 78 and they're 74. From listening to you, it sounds like Goldman ought to be 150 billion and Morgan Stanley ought to be 50. Why are there such parity, if you will, from a market cap standpoint between you and arguably, I mean, you may say that JP Morgan is your bigger competitor or what have you, but why is there on the two kind of standalone biggest investment banks with the best brands on Wall Street such parity in valuation when you have made this investment and seem to be so far ahead of them?
Yeah, so one of the challenges, and I think this happens in any industry, is, and it's just a reality, you're benchmarked against a group of peers, right? the investment banks. Yet, if you look at all of the investment banks, and you named Morgan Stanley and JP and Citi and B of A, each one is running a very different strategy, and
Right.
each one has an extremely different business mix, right? Like, we'll just look at Morgan Stanley with their wealth management business. That's just not the business we're in. We did not buy Solomon Smith Barney's brokerage business, right? And so the business models are just really, really different. And I think business mix is an important part of the equation. And with the Federal Reserve and its capital adequacy regime, some business mixes work better in certain states of the market than others.
So I want to turn, and I got to be watching here because I want to open up for questions in a little bit. I want to get, your view on the economy, and then I want to talk quickly about recruiting and diversity. So
Yes.
on just the broad economy, running the global equities business, what's your outlook? Obviously, Goldman Sachs has all sorts of company-wide outlooks, but what's your outlook on the economy where we are today? I talked yesterday about the fact that the Dow is over 27,000 at an all-time high. Interest rates are at 2.10 on the 10-year. Job growth was 240,000 new jobs in the month of June, and the unemployment rate is at 3.7%. You take those numbers and you say everything is amazing. Is everything amazing?
Well, so back when I was in the oil business, people would always say, "Well, Marty, you're the quant in the oil business at Goldman Sachs. What's your view on the oil price?" And I would say 50% chance it goes up and 50% chance it goes down. And if you're concerned about it going up, I got a deal for you. If you're concerned about it going down, I also have a deal for you, right? And so I grew up in what we call the risk neutral world, right? And actually this has been super valuable for me. I do not purport to have a crystal ball, and I'm extraordinarily skeptical of anybody who does, right? So I read all the pontification about what rates are for sure gonna do, right? And we look at our own polls of clients, like they're absolutely sure the Fed's gonna cut. Now they're absolutely sure the Fed's gonna raise. And if I go back, and I do this thing, I actually look at the statements people make about the future and compare them to actuals, and I have yet to find anything that was better than a coin flip. And so that tends to be me. I found when I was CFO of Goldman Sachs that served me really, really well, right, on forward-looking statements. Now,
If Paul Ryan answers my questions about politics the way you just answered the question about economics, I'm in real trouble. I'm in real trouble because I'm going to hold his feet to the fire a little bit more than that.
Okay, but here's one thing I will say. So we look at the credit cycle, and this is a question we get asked all the time as we're building a new consumer credit business. Aren't you aware of the credit cycle? Of course we're aware of the credit cycle. We know that it goes up and down. And I wish somebody would blow a whistle and tell us when it's going to turn.
Right.
Right. And here is an error in thinking, which is a quant would have a particular terminology for this, but the idea that because the cycle has lasted for a long time, the probability of a turn is therefore higher. That's nonsense. Like, that's a classic bias in human reasoning. And the past does not exist. The future does not exist. The only thing that exists is right here, right now. And it doesn't matter how long we've been on a growth trajectory as to answer the question, when will it be over? I think the only thing that we can say is that, yes, it's likely cyclic, and it will likely turn. And we have to be ready for that, and that's what we do in all of our risk management. And of course, we have probabilities, and we have market implied probabilities. We spend a lot of time and energy looking at what option prices are telling us about the future direction of interest rates, right? But it's all what the market is telling us right now, the market's view about the future, and we have to remember what every prospectus says, the past is a poor predictor of expected future performance. And so, yes, there's all kinds of signals in the market that are telling us that you can look at the yield curve, you can look at all kinds of things, but are they predictors of what's going to happen? Is there a causal connection? No.
So beyond then, sort of, if you will, a research report type view, Goldman Sachs today is making investments.
Yes.
You're making bets across your enterprise that say, we got to grow in Europe because we see growth in Europe. We got to grow the equity trading desk because we see a lot of future in equity trading,
Yes.
or et cetera.
The
So
consumer
can you give
yeah.
any insight as it relates to where you all are
Sure.
putting your bets?
Yes, absolutely. So
Okay.
and our bets are not dependent on a market cycle. And you also got to remember, for instance, you look at our equities business. There's this assumption that because we're in the equities business, that when stock prices are high, that's good for us, and when stock prices are low, that's bad for us. And that is not the case, right? We're there because clients want to sell something or they want to buy something, and we are not directional. Now, the thing that is bad for us is when clients just don't do anything. If nobody's trading, if everybody's just sitting on the sidelines, that's when we've got a real problem in our business. But it does not go with the direction of interest rates or yields or credit spreads or equity markets. Now, if you look at the strategy, and David will have said this in our earnings call yesterday at some length, we are absolutely, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the Federal Reserve's capital adequacy regime, which is hugely important and has been hugely successful, we are looking to have more of our revenues be recurring. And that's happening across the business. And so that's why we're growing the consumer business. That's why we're growing our real estate and alternatives investing business. And that's why we're growing the market making and financing businesses, where that kind of business happens day in and day out and is not tied to the particular trajectory of a particular market.
Got it. All right, I want to ask one final question, then I'm going to turn it over to other people for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please start thinking about it. We talked a little bit about diversity, and your comment to me was, when we looked at doing diverse hiring at Goldman Sachs for the sake of doing diverse hiring, it was basically a failure. When we focused on doing diverse hiring because there was a business interest and a real economic interest to it, it took off. So can you give a little insight into that?
Yeah, so for years and years, there really wasn't much of a diversity conversation on Wall Street. We would notice that we were not diverse, and not much happened. And then I would say in about 2000 time frame, we started saying, okay, this can't be a good thing. We've got to work harder on diversity because it's the right thing to be more diverse. And we would also say to ourselves, we aspire to reflect the demographics of the cities where we operate. The real breakthrough was when we began to realize that diversity wasn't just a good thing, it wasn't an altruistic right thing, but it was a smart and extremely commercial thing to do. And the idea was actually pretty obvious, and it came to us from our trading businesses. The thing that we're always looking for is uncorrelated risk, right? Most of the things you're looking at are going to be correlated to something else, so they're not really interesting. But the only free lunch is diversification. And I would say another free lunch is diversity. You get people in the room who have a different point of view, a counter or uncorrelated point of view. And then we started saying to ourselves, if we're doing something that makes those diverse people not feel included, then we're doing something that's definitively bad for business, and we have to stop doing that. So once we got on that trajectory, things really started to change. And once you go on that trajectory, then of course you have new problems. And so here's where we are right now. When we look at our junior hiring right out of universities, there, over the last few years, we've been really intentional. We finally said, okay, time out. The idea that there's any reason that our junior people coming out of colleges would be other than 50% women, we flatly reject it. That's not going to happen. There can't be a single good reason for that. And the objections would come back, well, you know, when you're hiring engineers, that's hard to have 50% women. And we said, thank you for sharing your perspective. The engineers are going to be 50% women. Then the next objection was, well, we hire so many in India, and don't you know India's this, India's that. It's going to be hard to hire 50% women in India. We said, okay, again, the concern is noted. the next class is going to be 50% women. So we have gotten there, and this is the same for Hispanics, LGBT, African Americans, veterans, all of the diverse groups that we're looking at. So wonderful. The junior people are 50%, are reflecting the demographics. It's a baseline, like that has to happen. But then here's what we still notice. If you look at any leadership group, so as you go up in the hierarchy and you start from analysts to associates to vice presidents to managing directors to partners to executive committee partners to management committee to the executive office, whatever group you look at, it's going to be, if it's 50% women in the junior ranks, by the time you get up there, it's nowhere near 50%.
Right.
It just drops off. And often it was stated for a long time, and the reason it drops off is because women bear disproportionate burden in child rearing, child care. That turns out, I mean, it is true that women that do bear a disproportionate burden, but that's not the reason we're being less diverse as you get to more senior ranks. And we know it's not the reason because you see the same phenomenon with Hispanics, and you see the same phenomenon with blacks. You see it again and again. And we particularly noticed that at a particular career inflection point, from vice president to managing director, that's where we're losing people. It's just becoming much less diverse when you go from this rank to that rank. And so the question is, what is going on? And we've spent a few years understanding what's going on. Turns out there's two things that are going on, why we're losing people as you get there. One thing that's going on is complicated and very difficult to arrest. And it's something like this. There's no active discrimination that's pushing black people, Hispanics, any group out of the system. We don't have any evidence that that's happening, and we'd be ruthless if it were happening, but we call it subtle and significant. There's lots of things happening in the environment that are almost beneath the radar. So I'm just making up this example, but we had an equity trader who played hockey, and it turns out that all of the traders who worked for him were also hockey players. And that's not a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a thing. And so what was happening is that people who weren't hockey players were just looking at this hockey crowd and saying, oh, that doesn't really seem like our crowd, and they're absenting themselves, and they're not getting the best assignments, and they're not getting the best trading books, so they don't get paid, so they don't get promoted, so they get unhappy, and so they float out of the system. That kind of thing is happening all over the place, and changing that is really, really hard. The other thing that's happening is, and I'm sure this is in your industry, we hire people from, we call them lateral hires. They don't come from school, they come mostly from other banks. And the other banks aren't diverse in those senior roles, and so the pool from which we're hiring is terribly not diverse, right? And so by hiring people from that pool, even if we were doing a good job at the entry levels, that's getting diluted out. And this is very hard because the excuse is a good one. The pool of people we're hiring from is all straight white men. What are we supposed to do about it? Well, it's not all straight white men, and you have to look harder. And so this is one thing that we're doing. We're actually saying every time we're hiring someone as a senior lateral, we are insisting that we cast the net very broadly. And I want to know, who are the diverse people that we interviewed for this role, and why did we say no to them? And it can't be the same group of diverse people that we keep adding on to the list, right? It's got to be rotating. And so it's taking a while, it's working. This is going to be a 20-year journey, and why we're doing it is we get better and smarter, make better decisions, make more money, as not just because it's altruistic.
Thank you. Marty's comment there reminds me of Christy Haubegger's comment yesterday about how would you feel if one of the white men in this room walked into a room that was filled with African-American women, and you're the only person in there, and how you would feel there, and wearing that hat, if you will, wearing that feeling of not being in a space that you can be and act the way you want to act. And as a hockey player, and as someone who has a bias to finding other people who played sports in college or whatever else, you can see that play in the way that we say that person acts like me, thinks like me, sounds like me. Great, that's someone I want to have around me because it's going to make me feel good about what I'm doing, and they'll reinforce my thinking and what have you. And it's that change those subtle biases, what you're going at, and that's just it's so insightful and so important that we identify those subtle biases that exist that make it so that people can't break through.
Identify and do something about it, which is hard.
I want to open it up for a question or two before I thank Marty for this engaging conversation. Any questions for Marty?
Raise your hand and we'll get you a mic. Here. Yep.
Quick question. Did anyone ever solve the 900 to 10,000th exponential medical issue?
Yeah.
And do you still want to solve it?
No, it's a great question. Actually, so here's something that happens maybe once a month. I get a random email from someone out in the internet whom I do not know. And the email is something like, I read your Stanford PhD dissertation in 1990. That I always hyperventilate because I know I never read the thing after I handed it in. And then they go on to say, and actually the algorithms work really well. And so that's a major relief. And so even back in the 90s, we were working on speed ups to solve some of these hard problems. So it turns out in medical diagnosis, you do not need to know that some disease has probability 0.8637. You just need to know that one disease is really much more likely than all the other diseases, right? So it's really the rank ordering that's important. And so you can actually you can do some calculations that allow you to speed it up. Now, even in the 90s, when we made those speed ups, the computers still were not fast enough. But now that you've got millions of computers doing neuromorphic deep learning algorithms on one big board, and you can rent all that from Google or Amazon in the cloud, all of those problems are becoming tractable. And so, basically it's working really well. Any problem where you can reduce it to a categorization. So I've got a lot of training instances of a problem. Like, here's my favorite example, cats. On the internet, people love posting pictures of cats for whatever reason. And so if you think about it, there's all these pictures, and then someone mentions the word cat, like this is my cat at breakfast this morning. And so you've got billions of images that people have categorized as ones that contain cats and ones that don't. And now you can take any machine learning algorithm, it's available almost for free, and you can train it against that huge database, and you can show it an image, and it will instantly tell you whether there's a cat. And so there's some similarities to the problem of medical diagnosis. I would just say, okay, instead of cats, we've got a professional pathologist who's categorized all these slides. These contain cancer cells, these do not contain cancer cells. Conceptually, it's the same thing as cats. And so computers are really good at solving those problems now.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clear and very succinct messages. Going back to your point about trying to predict the future. Many of us in the financial services or real estate, we wrestle with the future, try to come up with estimates.
Yes.
And if the data is overwhelming against being able to do so effectively and accurately, why do we keep doing it?
Well, I think you'd almost have to ask an anthropologist or a psychologist why human beings want to predict the future, and then why human beings want to influence the future, right? I think, to me, it's no different than reading entrails and looking for patterns in clouds and doing rain dances. Right, I just don't think any of those things are very useful activities, and certainly at Goldman Sachs we've evolved, right, and we've evolved for a bunch of reasons. Maybe because, among other things, the Volcker rule is actually quite appropriately making it very difficult for banks to take principal and proprietary positions. We take principal positions because we're making markets to clients. But proprietary, meaning we're looking into our crystal ball and we're buying things because we think they're going to go up and selling things because we think we're going down. It's forbidden, so that's one thing, right? And actually, we would say, well, we got rid of most of those businesses before the Volcker rule actually came into effect. We got rid of them because we noticed that the revenues in those businesses were random walk around zero, right? I used to say, so traders would purport to know the future, and we would purport to believe them. But that didn't work out very well. And so finally we woke up and we said, directional risk is not our business. Our business is clients have risk they want risk they don't have, and it's our job to effect the risk transfer. It's not our job to say, oh, I want to buy this thing because I think it's going up, or I want to sell this thing because I think it's going down. I would say other businesses are going to evolve in that direction, and we got there earlier, not through any brilliance, but because the world required us to adapt to that and give up on that illusion.
Final
Anyone
one.
else?
Anyone else? Great. Marty, thank you
That was a
very
pleasure.
much. I greatly appreciate you coming. Thank you.
so much.
Thanks.
Thanks for inviting me.
Really appreciate it.